All right, joining us right here on ET Now, this is the India Development Debate. I'm Supriya Shrinate. The RBI board has decided to transfer an interim surplus of 28,000 crore rupees to the government for half of the year after applying the economic capital framework and a limited audit review. This was the first board meeting after the interim budget and was addressed by the finance minister. This is the second successive year that the RBI will transfer the interim dividend to the government. The government expects a higher amount from the banks and the financial institutions and the RBI. Will this move the needle on deficit? Is this a good practice? What will the Bimal Jalan committee do to all of this and more? We're joined by a stellar panel of guests right here. Mr. R. Gopalan, former secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, former finance secretary as well. Abizar Diwanji, partner and national leader, financial services, EY India, and Antarwan, professor, SPJIMR, and of course Maitri Busnoor Mata, consulting editor. Thank you very much, each one of you, for being with us. And Maitri, let me begin with you. 28,000 crore rupees is largely along expected lines, exactly the amount Mr. Garg had said right after the budget. So A, it looks like the fiscal and the monetary authorities are talking to each other, and this is very much on expected lines. I mean, the government had asked for this, the RBI has obliged, 28,000 crore comes in the kitty.
Oh yes, absolutely. In fact, as you mentioned, this is exactly the number that Mr. Garg had mentioned soon after the budget. And if you look at the budget numbers, the interim budget numbers, the budget estimate for profits from the Reserve Bank of India and central public sector owned banks was roughly about 54,000 crores. And the revised estimate was higher. It was about 74,000 crores. So government had already factored in this 28,000 crores. So there are no surprises at all. The government has also factored in the expenditure from this. So it's as if the government has spent the money, they were waiting for this to come, and the RBI is duly obliged. So it doesn't upset the budget math at all, except that perhaps this is the last time we're going to see an interim dividend, because once the Bimal Jalan committee submits its recommendations, my suspicion is that RBI would no longer make these interim dividend transfers, but would wait to the end for the end of the financial year and make a transfer once and for all. And we'll also have very concrete rules rather than these somewhat arbitrary transfers where the government decides a number and the central board duly signs along the dotted line. Doesn't send a very good signal, but yes, you're right. This is exactly the number that the government had factored in.
Okay, let me quickly take this across to Mr. Gopalan, and then I'll go across to the other experts. And in some sense, this was being frowned upon by experts like Vivi Reddy. They have very categorically said this is a sign of, the ways and means of how it's done. And he had said that such interim dividends contradict the spirit of putting in a limit on ways and mean advances, which are intended to meet any short-term funding mismatch that the government faces. So in some sense, an interim dividend is a new practice, but it's a practice that will help move the needle, many believe, on the budget deficit. Do you believe this greatly impacts the 3.4% figure and will help the government get there far smoothly than before?
Look, this interim dividend payment practice started last year with Mr. Urjit Patel. He paid 10,000 crores. So it is not a surprise that the government has extended this practice this year as well. The numbers, as we see, are the ones which you should look at. And second, you have to pay dividend only from realized profits. Now, in a half year, the realized profits in the next half year, due to some difficult situations when the bonds have to be, you have to do a OMO or something, or you're going to take the money back, or you have to do, meet the foreign exchange. When the money comes in, probably you may use the bonds to do that. So with all those things, if the bond portfolio in the RBI goes out, and also if there is a probability of appreciation of the rupee or some such thing, the gains will not be that much as we realize. So now we are presuming that at least there is going to be, if you pay 28,000 crores, you are presuming at least for the full year, 56 to 60,000 crores will be the realized gains for the year. That's something, the RBI accounts or balance sheet is not something like the company's balance sheet. But once again, if you look at the numbers, from 28,000 crores, from this 82,000 crores is presumed for 1920 as dividend and from banks. So this year 6,000 crores is coming by way of dividend from the banks. If you, net it out, going to be about 76,000 crores the government is presuming as dividend from RBI. So which means if you 28, probably another about 50,000 crores will come in the month of July, August for the year 1920. So perhaps my this thing is that, okay, a practice has been started, a practice is being continued. So in that sense, this is not a new practice. At the same time, the question is it's a realized gains for the full year. The realized gains for the full year may not be this much, but from what has been happening, probably the realized gains may be more than what it is, and therefore it is possible that the board must have looked into it. The audit committee of the board had looked into it, and only after this number has been arrived at. The twist is that this amount was announced on 1st of February or little before that, when the budget numbers were stacked up. The audit committee, I do not know when did it meet. Did it meet before or after is something that's a twist which one needs to look at.
Right, okay. Mr. Gopalan, I'll have to come in there. I think you're making an interesting point about the audit committee meeting, but just to put things in perspective, in fiscal year 18, when the RBI had transferred all of 50,000 crore rupees to the government, 10,000 crore rupees had come in as interim dividend. So 28,000 crore rupees is a lot higher than the 10,000 crore rupees that came in as interim dividend then, just to put things in perspective, and which is why many people believe that the second tranche could be even bigger, and which is also perhaps why that the government has revised the money from financial institutions, banks and RBI in the revised estimates to 74,410 crore rupees from the previous 54,817 crore rupees. Anant, I'll come to you. The sign of a larger tranche coming perhaps July, when the books finally close for the RBI, are a lot higher, and that money could be a lot bigger than just the 40,000 odd crore that came in last year. Because in correspondence to 40, 10 had come then.
Well, Supriya, look, frankly, the amount which needs to be transferred from the RBI to the government is clearly a function of how much the RBI earns. And unlike a normal commercial organization, RBI has definitive sources of income. It has sources of funds, including CRR balances, including money in circulation. It earns interest on the bonds that it holds and the foreign currency it holds. So depending on how much it makes, it's supposed to transfer the entire money to the government. Now, frankly, this practice of paying an advance dividend, which was started the last year, as Mr. Gopalan said, is something that the RBI has resisted in the past. And as Dr. Reddy mentioned, and you also alluded to that, this is not a great practice. You don't take money from your subsidiaries in advance of the actual money being due. What was being due in August, you are preponing that, to use an Indian term, and taking it in this fiscal. It's part of the overall fiscal math that a lot of analysts, including me, have found questionable. There were three elements which we found questionable: very, very optimistic revenue projections. Second was off-balance sheet financing, particularly of Food Corporation of India, NHAI, and so on and so forth. And third was this element, which is this RBI dividend being preponed, so to speak. This element, frankly, is the smallest of the lot. 28,000 crores is barely, 15 basis points or so of fiscal deficit, so it doesn't move the needle a whole lot. The other two, frankly, are a lot more scary, and in totality, the number becomes quite large. Hopefully, and all governments are guilty of this, of padding up the fiscal deficit and hiding it in some form or the other. Hopefully, once the elections are behind us and once the electoral politics are behind us, whichever new government comes in will do some repair and make the numbers a lot more believable. But hopefully, this is a trend which stops right now, and we don't do any more of this egregious, preponing of cash flows due later.
No, fair point. Abhisar Diwanji, I'll come to you. And what will you keep a keen eye, a keen watch on? The fact that this is perhaps going to move the needle, however little it does, on the budget deficit, the fact that the government could not meet its tax targets and also its divestment targets, and this money could come in handy to get to 3.4%, perhaps a lot easier. Because, we were having a conversation with Maithili earlier, and she had raised this pertinent point that where this money is going to be invested is what will assuage concerns.
Absolutely. So, first of all, I think it's going to, the 20,000 crore surplus odd with the revised estimates at 74,000 crores will clearly help where other areas of the budget has not performed. Also, I do believe, to whatever extent it contributes to reducing the fiscal deficit, and I'm sure the RBI and its governor and everybody else would have been prudent enough to make sure that they don't completely end up the coffers, empty out the coffers of the RBI just to meet a fiscal number. And as was rightly said by Anand, the number is too small to even talk about. So I think the issue is about providing the government some level of capital. I think there was also a big debate earlier on with the erstwhile governor where the government has held that there should be some element of dividend which could not be come by, and this time the RBI has kind of obliged and the government has helped, and whatever the reasons behind them. More importantly, if it is not a number which moves the needle, and there is a level of prudence that the RBI has done in declaring that dividend, I don't see that as a problem. I'll just address the concern of some of the other guys. If actually it looks good sentimentally on our fiscal deficit, I think it will help go a long way in terms of making sure that the market sentiment on the bond market as well as on the equity markets is well protected, and hence the RBI's reserve will not be used to that extent going forward. So that's, I think, one important element. The other element is that whether it's an interim dividend or a final dividend, in my view, is a moot question, as long as the RBI has sufficient funds to be able to make sure that it can support OMO going forward and hence avoid any unnecessary fluctuations. So in my view, I think we should give some credence to the RBI and its authorities as well as the government that where the amounts are not as material, maybe we should not make a big issue out of it in the first place.
No, fair point indeed. And I think one of the things that is important to tell our viewers is that there was this whole, debate about the government raiding RBI reserves and, a lakh and 30,000 crore coming and all of that. So none of that has happened. The interim dividend is also 28,000 crore rupees. It is not astronomical like 60,000 crore rupees that was being spoken about. But very quickly, before I move forward and talk about the Vimal Jalan committee and also, in terms of optics wise, what does this tell you about the government and the RBI relationship? Mr. Gopalan, a larger question also is, how much of the budget deficit will this help plug? 28,000 crore rupees is small as far as the 74,410 crore entire pie is concerned from banks, financial institutions and the RBI, but I'm presuming it's going to need move the needle a little.
Well, this is only 20,000 crores is about 0.1% of the GDP. So, that's not a big amount. Now, the point remains that you should understand that the disinvestment income from the budget this year is they are projecting at 80,000 crores and next year 90,000 crores, and my information is they are well on way to achieving that. Probably this amount was thought of for the purpose of the additional expenditure on Farm Kisan, PM Kisan scheme and those other extra expenditures which have been budgeted. So, probably there was some way to meet this expenditure, and probably this was the way they thought prudent to do. But once again, we need to look at it from the holistic thing of how this is going to impact various financial markets. Anant and others are much better positioned to explain what these things are. But to me, this is a very small amount. I won't call it a big amount.
Okay, you're not going to call this a big amount, you'll call it a small amount. But let me just get into this, the optics of this, and what does this also tell as far as the government and the RBI relationship is concerned. And Maithili, I'm going to rewind the clock to about 3-4 odd months back, where things like, raiding the reserves, where things like the RBI and the government being on war path, Article 377 invoked, and all of Section 27 being invoked, and all of that was concerned. It looks like from then to now, tempers have cooled off and the two sides are talking to each other. And even if the RBI has obliged the finance ministry, it's also taken the fiscal authority to back off and not ask for astronomical numbers and the entire surplus to be transferred in any of that.
Supriya, to be very honest, even when that debate was going on those 3 or 4 months ago, it was always a very misinformed debate. In fact, the finance ministry had clarified on a number of occasions that we are not going to ask for the money to be taken out of its reserves. We are only talking of surplus from its earnings. But I think such was the level of the decibel level of the debate that time that nobody was willing to listen, because frankly it would have been impossible almost in terms of sheer accounting honesty to do that transfer from the reserves. So the question was always a transfer from its profits. But the problem only really is with this number as I see it, is that even at the time on the 1st of February when the government presented its budget, it had announced a number of 28,000. This is well before the central board met. So it does not send a very good signal when the government decides and the central board duly signs on the dotted line. The central board should have gone into the RBI's accounts, should have seen what is the amount of transfer that can be made. Have they earned this much profit in the first half year of the RBI? Because remember, the RBI's year runs from July to June, and then that number should have been decided after an audit. So when this number is exactly what the government has decided much before the central board met, it doesn't send a very good signal of the RBI central board's autonomy. And to my mind, that is what is more objectionable. And I hope that once the Bimal Jalal Committee submits its report, we will have some dispassionate, uniform rules, and we will not have this kind of situation where the government decides and the central board duly falls in line. That is not a good thing at all. Even though the RBI, as I said, has only operational autonomy, it is not independent in law. It's important that that operational autonomy is maintained at all times.
No, that's a good point that you're talking about. And Abizar, I wonder if you want to make a quick comment on that. That are you going to see this as relationship between the monetary and the fiscal authority has resumed, where the two are talking to each other, they're on the same page, or are you actually going to see it as Maithili sees it, that a number has been quoted by the finance ministry, the entire board falls in line, and this raises questions about the autonomy and independence of the central bank?
No, I hope that this is just a communication timing issue. And maybe it was already pre-decided before the board meeting, it was communicated. RBI would have also given its consent, and hence, somebody just spoke out of the turn and the ministry spoke before the government. I hope that's the case. The larger issue, and I agree with Maithili, the larger issue is the RBI's autonomy going to be maintained? Democracy is based on certain autonomous institutions, and RBI, in India at least, is a very critical institution. So it's not about the 28,000 now. I just hope this is not a precursor that every time the government announces the dividend and the RBI concurs. I hope that doesn't recur often, and I hope this is a one-time communication issue. Going forward, I think with the Bimal Jalal Committee coming in, and I have a lot of respect for that gentleman, with that report coming in, a committee coming in, we will actually see a lot more accountability coming into how this kind of dividend gets declared. And dividend declaration, like RBI, like every other thing, is as good as a corporate. When the shareholders, it's deemed that the shareholders would benefit more from getting a money, a dividend is declared. It also actually loosens up and helps the cash management of the entity. Similar with the RBI, as long as it's based on sound principles of a decision taken not under any undue influence, i.e. the integrity of the institution, but on sound principles. If decisions are taken on sound principles, be it interim dividend or final dividend, it doesn't matter. As long as, be it communication surpluses, it doesn't matter. As long as the intent is that it is an institution which believes that the dividend needs to be paid to the government, and it does so in its own autonomous fashion.
Anand, will you have issues about this dividend coming ahead of elections? Because where this money is going to be spent and how it's going to be invested is key to the autonomy, independence and all of that debate on one side. Are you someone who worries about this money coming in before an election year?
I'll tell you what I worry about, Supriya, and this is agnostic across politics, purely from an economic sense. One, like I mentioned earlier, there is a fear that the fiscal deficit headline number that we see is understated, and the true extent of the fiscal deficit is larger, hidden by optimistic revenue projections, the small amount on the RBI dividend preponement, and off-balance sheet borrowing for FCI, etc. The second element is the point you mentioned about the Bimal Jalal Committee. By the way, the terms of reference of that committee are very clear. They have to determine the appropriate level of capital that RBI needs to hold. If they determine in their wisdom that the RBI holds more capital than is required, it follows therefore that they will transfer in some tranches or some fashion extra money to the government, which effectively, along with the open market operations of bonds, etc., is going to be a monetization of the deficit, whether we like it or not. So both put together, you have a large fiscal situation and you have a large monetization happening alongside. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mind us spending on the fiscal side. If the country is growing at 12% and you can borrow funds at 7.5%, 8%, by all means we should borrow. Then the question becomes, what are we doing with that borrowing? As long as we are borrowing to invest in roads, education, irrigation, ports, essentially productive investments, that should be absolutely fine. But unfortunately, the math shows that a lot of those investments are going into revenue expenditures. They're going into salaries, into pensions, into farm doles, into interest costs, into defense, none of which eventually will give us productive investment. So the quality of the spend is a bit suspect, and that is something for us to worry about. Last year, all parties put together agreed that the FRBM, the governing principles around our budget management, will no longer track what is a revenue deficit, which is the money we are borrowing just to pay our current expenditures. Now, that is unfortunately a sad development. We do need oversight of what we do with the borrowings and where that money goes. I have no problem if the money goes into productive investments. Unfortunately, as things stand, they are not going into productive investments, they're going into current spending. Hopefully, it will improve as we go along, and once the elections are behind us, this will be behind us.
You know, the elections will be behind us. There will be another election that will come, and we will again be sitting on the same debate, and which is why the Bimal Jalan Committee's recommendations will be very important. Request you to be a little brief, but Mr. Gopalan, while, you know, this interim dividend transfer second in a row adds to speculation of a broader change of approach by the RBI in its dividend management, where and what approach do you believe the Bimal Jalan Committee is going to take, given that there's already a practice in place of transferring interim dividend, even though former RBI governors have kind of frowned upon this?
Well, let me put it this way. Bimal Jalan Committee will indicate what is the economic value of capital they must hold. So, if there is a surplus, as Anand says, some way of transfer will take place. May not be in the way the monetization of the deficit. Maybe it can happen in the way of government, the bonds which are already available, they are extinguished, and therefore there's a fiscal space available for the government to go for more borrowing. This is one. But the point remains that by RBI Act, the surplus after providing for reserves has to be transferred to the government in its entirety. The question is, what is going to be the reserves that are going to be for the particular year we have got to sequester for. So, that calculation in some sense will be provided for by the Jalan Committee, and in future, just like Malegam Committee provided for in 2013, Jalan Committee will get into the same thing and probably will look into various variance analysis, look into various scenarios, and then look at what is the kind of capital which is going to be required by RBI. And once that is fixed, obviously in a particular year, if we have to transfer some amount of reserves, from the earnings to the reserves, obviously that will be transferred, the balance rest of the amount will come back to the government. So, we have to wait how the Jalan Committee report is going to pan out. But once again, on interim dividend, well, government is the owner, and in some sense the government has a claim on this thing, and therefore a payment of interim dividend, in my view, so long as the overall dividend is governed by Jalan Committee recommendations, I don't think it is going to be bad.
Okay, Mr. Gopalan, I'll have to give a quick last word to Maithili Busnurmak, my consulting editor, and then we'll have to close this show. Maithili, just to be very clear here, and the information that we have in the official press release of the RBI is that the extent accounting principles as per existing ECF were followed to arrive at 28,000 figure. My own understanding is that there was a dialogue between the RBI and the government, and the DA secretary perhaps spoke out of turn when he said that in public. Given that the extant economic capital framework was applied to this, can anybody have objections to 28,000 crore rupees? And more importantly, does this end the debate of the government trying to raid the reserves and the RBI falling in line?
Well, I hope it ends the debate, and I do hope we get concrete and clear rules from the Bimal Jalan Committee. But Supriya, it's a bit like getting your salary, taking your salary midway through the month. You take the salary for 15 days, and then at the end of the month, you're only going to get another 15 days. So the government is clearly getting the income and it's spending the money. So next year we'll have a bigger problem. So this really doesn't solve the problem. It still means that the government has to be very careful. You're assuming that the income for the next year you're taking in the previous year and you're already spending that money. So that's not a very good sign. The government tends to overspend and then look for its money later, because this year we have 68, next year's budget is 69,000. So clearly the RBI will have less and less to transfer for its reserves. Is that a good thing? I'm not very sure. So hopefully the Bimal Jalan Committee will give us a clear set of rules, and once and for all this debate will be ended.
No, absolutely, and this will also set the record straight of how much does the RBI need to hold, because there are experts out there who believe that the RBI holds a lot more than it really needs to, and as compared to some of the other global central banks, perhaps a tad higher than many people are comfortable with. But on that note, completely out of time here, thank you very, very much, Abzal Diwanji, Mr. R. Gopalan, Anand Narayan, and of course Maithili Busnurmat for joining us. It looks like the war zone is over and the monetary and the fiscal authority are out of that war zone. 28,000 crore rupees is what the government had wanted from the RBI. The central bank has delivered on that, but they have followed the economic capital framework principles to arrive at that figure. So no one can quarrel with why so much money has come in as interim dividend. We can raise questions on the government's practice of getting interim dividend instead of a final one, but this was not put in practice now. This has been in practice for almost 2 years now, and so you can't blame Mint Street for doing so. But on that note, completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate, we take a quick breather. There's plenty more that's following up right next. Do stay tuned.